One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority." He answered them, "I will also ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he'll say, 'Why do you not believe him?' But if we say from man, all the people would stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered him that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things."
Kind of a showdown here. They confront him, and they said, "Tell us by what authority you're doing these things. Who gave you this authority?" Doing what things, more than likely?
Cleaning out the temple.
Yeah, exactly. And if he says he has God's authority, they'll condemn him for blasphemy. If he says he doesn't have authority, then he's taken it over where he doesn't have the right. Isn't that typical religious establishment stuff? They're more concerned if he's got a license to preach than whether or not what he says is true. Difference to make where he got his authority if it's true. But they want the official authorization. And of course they thought it was their temple, so who gave him the permit to come in and rearrange the furniture? And Jesus answers by doing what?
Asking a question.
Yeah, a good way to answer is to ask. And Jesus says, if you answer mine, I'll answer yours. He's not under an obligation to answer all of them. In a sense, he's testing their honesty as questioners. But if they answer the question correctly, it will lead them to be able to answer their own question. And Jesus is best at everything he does. He's also the best at asking questions. This is a great one. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Isn't that the question we ought to ask about everything? Every religious belief, every practice. The question is, does it come from God or man? That's always the question. And we know it by whether or not it's in the scripture or not. We don't ask, well, is it successful? Does it make you feel good? Is it fun? Is it non-offensive? Ask, does it come from God or man? That's the question. And they do something kind of funny in trying to answer the question. What do?
They think through the consequences of the particular answers.
I know.
Which says they are not looking for
The truth.
Yes. You don't determine truth by analyzing what the result will be if you say one way or the other. They are not concerned about truth, but they realize they're kind of in a dilemma here, because if they say John's baptism was from heaven, well, he'd say, why didn't you believe him? That would be a good question, right? If it comes from God, we ought to believe it. If they say he was from man, well, the people thought he was from God, so they don't really want to admit before the people they're skeptics. By the way, what was the right answer?
From God.
If that's true, then where did Jesus get his authority?
From God.
John testified about Jesus, it would answer their question for them. But since neither answer is going to have good results, they think, what do they say?
We don't know.
No.
Wow. What are they doing? They are totally evading the truth. You ever know, like, people at a criminal trial or whatever, they can't ever remember anything that happened? That's kind of a cop-out. That was their cop-out. Of course, look at what this makes them look like before everybody. Totally incompetent. This is a multiple choice question with only two answers, two options. They can't even get that one. I mean, John was super popular not long before everybody gone out to him and been baptized, and they haven't even figured out if he came from God or man. Well, if they can't judge John, how do they think they can judge Jesus? And so Jesus doesn't answer. Because they have no right to have their question answered because they have shown clearly they have no interest in the truth. They're unwilling to answer because they don't like what he might say next or what might happen next if they did answer. That's clear proof they aren't interested in the truth. And sometimes the best thing we can do when somebody asks especially a prejudicial question, answer with a question that will answer their question. They're not going to be willing to do that. A lot of times they want to put you on the spot, but you turn it back on them with another parallel question, they won't deal with it. You're not under obligation to answer a question to every person who's trying to just prejudice the audience. Thoughts and comments?
you see this in classes sometimes, like, someone disagrees with the point that's being made, and they say, well, is this a salvation issue? It kind of diverts the attention from the point itself to, is this a black and white, you're saying everybody goes to hell if they don't get
And if
this
you
right.
say it is a salvation issue, then you're divisive. And you say if you say it's not, then it doesn't matter, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
It's a way of stifling discussion. And my answer to that would be, what if you knew that God really wanted you to do something, but it's not a salvation issue? Would you do it? Just because you want to please Him? Or does it have to affect your salvation before you'll try to please Him? Do you serve God because you love Him, or just to get heaven? I think it doesn't matter. You're exactly right. That is strictly designed to be prejudicial. It's a good illustration there.
So Jesus is in his last few days. He came into the temple and cleaned house, which set the Jewish leaders off. They ask him who gave him the authority to do that, and he answers with a question they refuse to answer. And so things are getting pretty tense, I would say. They're all a little testy. And Jesus tells them a parable. So Luke 20, verses 9 to 18. So Jesus tells this story about a man who planted a vineyard and rents it out. The rent payment appears to be a share of the crop. That's kind of a typical way you do with renting farm land. So at harvest time, he sends a slave to get the crop, and what happens?
They beat him up and
Give him any fruit, yeah. And so he sends another slave, and what do?
They beat him and they treat him shamefully, and he still doesn't get any.
And the third one?
They wound him and cast him out, and I don't think he got any crop then. Anyway.
Yeah, so it's like every servant's treated worse than the one before.
Mm-hmm.
How would you feel if you were the vineyard owner about now?
Unhappy.
Yeah, I think that's when I'd be calling my lawyer and taking him to court or something. But instead, what does this owner decide to do?
Send his son.
Thinking, well, they'll surely respect my son. And what do they do to him?
Kill him.
Because they think that by killing the son,
They're going to get the vineyard.
because they assume that the son came because the father's died, and if they kill the son, then there's no heir, and then they're on the vineyard, and then they're just trying to take it over. There's nobody there to claim it. That's, I assume, what their reasoning is. What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Well, obviously, he'll destroy them and rent it out to some other people. This is a really easy parable to understand, it seems to me. Who's the owner of the vineyard?
God.
What's the vineyard? That may be a little harder.
God's people.
God's people and the blessings He gives to His people. Who are the vine growers?
Jews.
Yeah, and especially the Jewish leaders. Who are the servants that were sent to collect the crop?
Prophets.
The prophets, the Son,
The
Jesus.
son.
And so God's going to destroy them because they've been unwilling to give fruit to God and look at what they did to the prophets and ultimately to Jesus. And you see this as God is sort of making His last appeal to the Jewish leaders by sending Jesus. Not a prophet, but His Son. And when they face the most critical decision of their life, what are they going to do with the Son? And they turn and kill Him. God's not going to put up with, the renters that do something like that. Do we ever do anything like that? Would we ever take God's blessings and commandeer them from God and think that we can have them all for ourselves and do what we want to with them and not even listen to any of the people God sends to warn us? That's an easy thing to do, is we kind of think, I'm the owner, God gave me these blessings, they're mine now, I don't have to give God anything, which is really outrageous when you consider the truth of the matter. So that's something that happens sometimes. So he says in verse 17, the stone which the builders rejected became the chief cornerstone. So the builders like building a building. They come across this stone, they can't use it. And so they can't use the stone. God takes it and makes it the main stone in the building he's building. Of course, what does the stone represent? Jesus. And he says everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, and anybody the stone falls onto will be scattered like dust. If a vase falls on the stone, that's bad for the vase. If the stone falls on the vase, that's really bad for the vase, right? Either way you look at it, that's not a good deal. And so if we fall over Jesus or he falls on us, either way, we're in bad shape. What's the one thing we ought to do with Jesus? In terms of the analogy here.
Build off of it?
Build on him, yeah. Build ourselves up on him. Thoughts and comments on that whole section?
Who is reacting to it in verse 16?
I assume the people that are listening,
Not
probably
necessarily
some of whom realize what he's saying.
Okay. I knew other places it had said, wasn't it this parable that said they knew he was talking about them? And okay.
So I'm sure especially the Jewish leadership is not happy with this parable.
Wait, are they upset because the vine grower killed the renters, or are they upset because the renters killed the son? Or
I suspect they're upset because this means that he's saying God's going to punish them for what they're going to do to him. I suspect they really understand what this means.
okay, so like in the context of the parable, like they're upset with the owner of the vineyard coming and punishing and destroying the
Yes,
vine
I think
growers?
so. I think so,
Okay.
but because they understand what it means.
Right.
But yes, you're right.
But they're like defending themselves. Like,
Exactly.
we wouldn't do that, or, you know.
Maybe outraged that he thought this was a description of them or whatever.
Yes. No, I totally get that.
But you're right.
if
This
you
is
consider
the only logical thing. In fact, he was awfully, awfully patient to only do that this time.
yeah.
So they were shocked not by the renter's actions.
But by God's response. Right after this parable in Matthew 21:45, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them.
Okay.
So I think that's the thing. I think they understand it's about them, but if they did, it should outrage them that they're doing this. And also in Mark it says, and they were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them. So they understand it, and yet they're outraged with the Lord and not with themselves.
Exactly. Like, you don't get outraged at God when you understand that the parable is against you.
I think it's more like the whole story of it.
Right.
They're saying, we're not like that. Like, may that never be.
You're
I'm
really
not sure
an
it's
imposter.
specifically
This is not,
against
yes.
God's reaction.
Okay, maybe.
We always
maybe you're
rationalize
right.
our behavior, but it is amazing how sometimes we can get so almost blatant in just rejecting the Lord and our reaction and our defensiveness. Again, I think he's unreasonably patient. Well, they are not going to take this sitting down. They're going to trap Jesus with questions that he cannot answer. They're going to make him at least look really bad and maybe incriminate himself. So every group has its go. 19 to 26.
The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for a man to give tribute to Caesar, or not? But he perceived their craftiness, and said to them, Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. He said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent.
Okay. It says they know he spoke the parable against them. And then they want to capture him, they want to kill him, but the people. So they send these spies. Look at that in verse 20. They send spies who pretended to be righteous. Try to catch him in some statement. So think about they're sending spies to him. What does that mean? And so they question him and they say, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly, and you're not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Why start this question out with all that preamble?
Flattery.
Flattery. What is the purpose of this flattery?
So that he'll say, you don't need to pay taxes.
So what do you mean by that? Why would that make him say that?
Well, only because I've heard you say this before.
So they're sending spies because they don't want him to know where this question's coming from. And so they're trying to swell his head. They're trying to make him think, no, that's true. You know, man, I do teach the truth. care whose toes I step on. I just lay it on the line. That's right. I don't care if Caesar doesn't like it. I'll just say not to pay taxes. They're trying to make him get, boastful and prideful to the point where he says something reckless against Caesar. So if he knew where it came from, that'd be a problem because he'd be suspicious. Flattery is a trap for the one being flattered. But it's never a trap for Jesus. There's no trap for him. But either way, in a sense, they've got him either way. Because if he says, don't pay, obviously Rome is coming down on him for treason. If he says, do pay, the Jews won't like him, even the Jewish people, because they thought God was their real king. And if you pay to Rome, then you're denying the kingship of God. So either he's in trouble with Rome or he's in trouble with the people. It's a hopeless dilemma. They've got him over a barrel.
So do the Jews not pay taxes?
They did, but they didn't think you were supposed to.
So
They had to. They didn't have a choice. But they still, theoretically, opposed it.
Well, and it mentions in verse 20 that their intent was to catch him and deliver him to the authorities. So
Absolutely. They
wanted
want him to say, don't pay.
Say no.
Clearly it's what they want. But even if he said pay, he's in trouble. Well, he doesn't say either one. What does he say?
Give me a coin.
Yeah, can I see one of those coins you've got? I need a denarius. Really? Why would he need it? Whatever, we'll humor him. Here's a coin. They give him a coin. And he says, whose picture is that? And whose name's on that coin? And whose picture is it?
Caesar.
Whose name is it?
Caesar.
What does that say about that coin?
It's Caesar's.
Hey, if you got your picture on something and your name on it, I say it's yours. And if you want it back, what should I do? Give it back, it's yours. You can't keep something that doesn't belong to you when the rightful owner wants it back. If it's got his name and his picture on it, it's his. You give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, you give to God what belongs to God. Now what can you say about that? That was just brilliant. I mean, that's absolutely. That is a tremendous statement as far as I'm concerned about the Christian's relationship to government. I mean, that's perfect. Give to God what belongs to him, give to the government what belongs to the government. I mean, that in a nutshell, we take, a few books to say that, and Jesus says it in one sentence. Whose image were we made in?
God's.
Whose image were we remade in? God's. Whose name do we wear? Jesus. Who do we belong to? Yeah. So do you see that's another application from this that I think is worth thinking about. We're God's, and we ought to, act like that. So you've got the Sadducees, and we have the particular doctrine of the Sadducees, that they did not believe in.
The resurrection.
And we know from Acts 23 they had some other things they didn't believe in, like
Angels.
and spirits. Humans, men don't have spirits that live on after they die, kind of stuff. And so that's what the Sadducees believe. So they got this little deal that they've worked out based upon that law that you're supposed to marry your, brother's widow and raise up children to your brother if he dies childless after he married. That's called the Levirate law, based upon the Latin levere, which means brother-in-law or something like that. So he got this widow. She was married to a guy, then she married his brother, and then he died, and she married his brother, and he died, and she married his brother. There were 7 brothers that all married this woman. None of them had any children by her. And the question is, if there's a resurrection, whose wife's she going to be? They all 7 have equal right to her. She can't be married to 7 men in the resurrection. There can't be a resurrection. Now, they have that pretty well, planned out. I can't believe any group of brothers would be dumb enough to keep marrying her. Clearly, sure, her food is talk or something. But whatever, you get the idea. And this is a terrible way to determine truth. Try to overthrow it with some hypothetical question. Whether you know the answer to that or not, it doesn't change to whether or not there's a resurrection. You may not know the answer to the question, but it's a bad way to decide whether there's a resurrection. And it's that kind of question, what if somebody's on their way to the baptistry and a tree falls on them and kills them? Will they be saved? Well, what if I have no idea whether they'll be saved or not? What does that have to do with you? What does that have to do with the person who the tree doesn't fall on? It's maybe God wouldn't even let the tree fall on him. I don't know. Trees don't fall on people all that often. But Or whatever. You get the idea. I mean, hypothetical questions aren't the way to find out what the Bible says. But Jesus does better than that. Jesus said, well, first of all, verse 34 and 30 to 36, what does he say?
There's no marriage in
There's no marriage in heaven. That was a dumb question. Not even married in heaven. Actually, in heaven, you just like the
Angels.
that you also don't believe in. He got a little dig in there. But marriage is a temporary institution. Marriage is only for life. And it's important that we not overstress it. I think we get to the point where family values sometimes supersede God's values. And that shouldn't be. But even marriage only lasts this lifetime. It's temporary. And in heaven, evidently, there's no marriage. I don't know how all that works in heaven, but that's what Jesus says, so I believe it. And then he goes ahead to prove that the dead were raised in a passage you probably would never think of, where God at the burning bush tells Moses, I'm Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's God. But when God appeared to Moses at the burning bush, where were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
They were dry bones.
They were dry bones. They've been around in the grave for a long, long time. How can God say he's their God unless their spirits, which they also didn't believe in, were still alive, and there'd be a resurrection one day? They never thought about that passage as a passage to prove the resurrection. He proves the resurrection out of a passage they never thought about. And he explains that marriage doesn't have any relationship to the resurrection. So that question was totally blown out of the water. I've always thought that question was probably a question that every Sadducee kid asked every Pharisee kid in elementary school or something like that. Sounds like one of those that's kind of one of those perennial questions, where did Cain get his wife or something like that? And Jesus has the answer. Thoughts and comments on all that? Jesus just, you admire him when he gets in these tight spots. And he doesn't look like he's in a tight spot at all. He's totally in command of the situation, calmly says things, succinctly says things. Did you just kind of left? They were left without any more questions. What? I mean, every question they ask that's supposed to stump him just makes him look better. That's got to be frustrating. They'd be better off with no questions,
There's an idea that people in the Old Testament didn't have a concept of the resurrection.
There is that idea. I think there's a number of passages and things that show there were plenty of people who believed in the resurrection in the Old Testament, including New Testament statements like Hebrews 11 talking about the patriarchs looking for a city that has foundations and confessing they were pilgrims and strangers here. I mean, there's several statements there that clearly they're looking for a resurrection. There are lots of passages, but I think especially there's several things in Psalms and Proverbs. I don't know how you can explain them if they didn't have an idea of the afterlife. I mean, maybe they didn't have a developed idea of exactly what the resurrection involved, but they certainly thought of some sort of afterlife. Now, I don't think Job did. I think there may be some others that didn't, but I think certainly the Old Testament in general shows a belief in an afterlife. We know more than they did, but we don't know a lot. We don't have to know everything about how something works to believe it.
Paul quotes, talking about supporting preachers, he quotes the passage saying, don't muzzle the ox while it's threshing. And he says, God's not really concerned about oxen here, is he? And, I would say, well, if I read that passage, I would think God was talking about oxen. So it makes me wonder how much deeper meaning are we missing in some of these Old Testament passages.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I don't think he means by that God didn't intend for them not to muzzle the ox when they were threshing, but what he's saying is, do you think all God had in mind here was just a provision for animals? Is there a deeper lesson and principle that we need to get out of this? This wasn't just animals, though he didn't want them to muzzle the ox when they were threshing. Do you realize how much the Bible gets out of 3 whole verses historically on Melchizedek? We would have never remembered that guy's name if it hadn't been for Hebrews going into a whole lengthy dissertation. It's all logical. It's all there. It's just like, wow, I would have never thought about that. I would have never seen that. So you're right. The Bible is just an inexhaustible mine of understanding that we can always see more in it that we never thought about before. Well, Jesus got a question. 41 to 44. So Jesus' question is, they say the Messiah, the Christ, would be David's son, but in Psalm 110, David calls him his Lord. So how can David's son be David's Lord? Did they say then the Messiah was the son of David? Yeah. Did David call him his Lord in Psalm 110? The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand and rule over, on your throne. So that's a good question. They don't have an answer to that. But if they had answered that riddle, they would have answered their own objection to Jesus. What was their big objection to Jesus when it was all said and done? They said he was guilty of blasphemy because
He said, I am the Son of God.
How could David's son be David's Lord? Only if
He was also God.
he was man and God. This is the question they need to answer. Because when they answer this question, it solves their objection to Jesus. He wasn't just trying to stump them. He was trying to lead them to recognize, wait a minute, you guys have short-circuited this thing. You've got him being David's son. But you got to recognize David called him his Lord. So when you're making the Messiah only human, you're only looking at half the question. Isn't that amazing? Again, wow, he sees things that I wouldn't have seen. Thoughts and comments? (45 to 21:4).
And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on.
So he condemns the scribes for what in verse 46? Pride. What did they want? Honor. They wanted to impress. They dressed to impress. They wanted the respectful greetings. They wanted the chief seats. They wanted to be big shots, and they wanted everybody to know it. What was he condemning them for in 47?
Devouring widows' houses.
Odd diet.
They're just waiting for that.
So what does he mean, devouring widows' houses?
Take advantage of them?
How?
Apparently by getting all their money given to the church.
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea is they devoured their houses by extorting out of them all the high contributions and things like that. So they're devouring their living. I think that's the idea. They're you would think of old widows maybe as being a little less capable of defending themselves, maybe more vulnerable, maybe more easily led, maybe more emotionally driven. I mean, radio and TV preachers even today, it's people like poor widows who don't have any money that are giving them everything they got. And it's pathetic. And here these preachers and pastors are, driving around in their, luxury vehicles while they're being supported by people living hand to mouth. Jesus was not happy about that. And then they turn around and offer these long prayers for pretense sake. You always wonder, why do we have so much more to say to God in public than we do in private? Could it be that we're more interested in impressing people with our long prayers that sound good? That stinks more and more when you realize what their real motive was. Would you expect people offering long prayers and being seen as super spiritual to take advantage of poor widows?